The Great Splendour a King's Renunciation.
Kinh Ðại Thiện kiến vương.
Digha Nikaya, The Long Discourses. The Great Splendour, a King's Renunciation. Maha Sudassana Sutta. Thus have I heard. Once the Lord was staying at Kusinara in the Malas sal grove shortly before his final nibbana between the twin sal trees. The Venerable Ananda came to the Lord, saluted him, sat down to one side and said, "Lord, may the blessed Lord not pass away in this miserable little town of Wattle and Daub. Right in the jungle in the back of Beyond. Lord, there are other great cities such as Kampa, Rajagaya, Savatthi, Saketa, Kosambi or Varanasi. In those places, there are wealthy Khatiyas, Brahmins and householders who are devoted to the Tathagata, and they will provide for the Tathagata's funeral in proper style." Ananda, don't call it a miserable little town of Wattle and Daub, right in the jungle in the back of Beyond. Once upon a time, Ananda, King Mahasudassana, was a wheel-turning monarch, a rightful and righteous king, who had conquered the land in 4 directions and ensured the security of his realm. And this King Mahasudassana had this very Kusinara, under the name of Kusavati, for his capital. And it was 12 yojanas long from east to west, and 7 yojanas wide from north to south. Kusavati was rich, prosperous and well-populated, crowded with people and well-stocked with food. Just as the Diva city of Alakamanda is rich, as Sutta 16, verse 5.18, so was the royal city of Kusavati. And the city of Kusavati was never free of 10 sounds. By day or night, the sound of elephants, horses, carriages, kettle drums, side drums, lutes, singing, cymbals and gongs, with cries of eat, drink and be merry as 10th. The royal city of Kusavati was surrounded by 7 encircling walls. 1 was of gold, 1 silver, 1 beryl, 1 crystal, 1 ruby, 1 emerald, and 1 of all sorts of gems. And the gates of Kusavati were of 4 colors, 1 gold, 1 silver, 1 beryl, 1 crystal. And before each gate were set 7 pillars, 3 or 4 times a man's height. 1 was of gold, 1 silver, 1 beryl, 1 crystal, 1 ruby, 1 emerald, and 1 of all sorts of gems. Kusavati was surrounded by 7 rows of palm trees, of the same materials. The gold trees had gold trunks with silver leaves and fruit. The silver trees had silver trunks with gold leaves and fruit. The beryl trees had beryl trunks with crystal leaves and fruit. The crystal trees had crystal trunks with beryl leaves and fruit. The ruby trees had ruby trunks and emerald leaves and fruit. The emerald trees had emerald trunks and ruby leaves and fruit, while the trees of all sorts of gems were the same as regards trunks, leaves and fruit. The sound of the leaves stirred by the wind was lovely, delightful, sweet and intoxicating, just like that of the 5 kinds of musical instruments played in concert by well-trained and skillful players. And, Ananda, those who were libertines and drunkards in Kusavati had their desires assuaged by the sound of the leaves in the wind. King Mahasudassana was endowed with the 7 treasures and the 4 properties. What are the 7? Once, on a fast day of the 15th, when the king had washed his head and gone up to the veranda on top of his palace to observe the fast day, the divine wheel treasure appeared to him, 1,000-spoked, complete with felloe, hub and all appurtenances. On seeing it, King Mahasudassana thought, "I have heard that when a duly anointed Khatiya king sees such a wheel on the fast day of the 15th, he will become a wheel-turning monarch. May I become such a monarch." Then, rising from his seat, covering one shoulder with his robe, the king took a gold vessel in his left hand, sprinkled the wheel with his right hand, and said, May the noble wheel treasure turn, may the noble wheel treasure conquer. The wheel turned to the east, and King Maha Sudassana followed it with his fourfold army. And in whatever country the wheel stopped, the king took up residence with his fourfold army. And those kings who faced him in the eastern region came and said, "Come, your majesty, welcome. We are yours, your majesty. Rule us, your majesty." And the king said, "Do not take life. Do not take what is not given. Do not commit sexual misconduct. Do not tell lies. Do not drink strong drink. Be moderate in eating." And those who had faced him in the eastern region became his subjects. And when the wheel had plunged into the eastern sea, it emerged and turned south. And King Mahasudassana followed it with his fourfold army. And those kings become his subjects. Having plunged into the southern sea, it turned west. Having plunged into the western sea, it turned north, and King Mahasudassana followed it with his fourfold army. And those who had faced him in the northern region became his subjects. Then the wheel treasure, having conquered the lands from sea to sea, returned to the royal capital of Kusavati and stopped before the king's palace as he was trying a case, as if to adorn the royal palace. And this is how the wheel treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana. Then the elephant treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana, pure white, of sevenfold strength, with the wonderful power of traveling through the air, a royal tusker called Uposatha. Seeing him, the king thought, "What a wonderful riding elephant, if only he could be brought under control." And this elephant treasure submitted to control just like a thoroughbred that had been trained for a long time. And once the king, to try him, mounted the elephant treasure at crack of dawn and rode him from sea to sea, returning to Kusavati in time for breakfast. And that is how the elephant treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana. Then the horse treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana, with a crow's head, dark maned, with the wondrous power of traveling through the air, a royal stallion called Valahaka. And the king thought, "What a wonderful mount, if only he could be brought under control." And this horse treasure submitted to control just like a thoroughbred that had been trained for a long time. And that is how the horse treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana. Then the jewel treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana. It was a beryl, pure, excellent, well cut into 8 facets, clear, bright, unflawed, perfect in every respect. The luster of this jewel treasure radiated for an entire yojana roundabout. And once the king, to try it, went on night maneuvers on a dark night with his fourfold army, with the jewel treasure fixed to the top of his standard. And all who lived in the villages roundabout started their daily work, thinking it was daylight. And that is how the jewel treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana. Then the woman treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana, lovely, fair to see, charming, with a lotus-like complexion, not too tall or too short, not too thin or too fat, not too dark or too fair, of more than human, diva-like beauty. And the touch of the skin of the woman treasure was like cotton or silk. And her limbs were cool when it was hot, and warm when it was cold. Her body smelled of sandalwood and her lips of lotus. This woman treasure rose before the king, and retired later, and was always willing to do his pleasure, and she was pleasant of speech. And this woman treasure was not unfaithful to the king even in thought, much less in deed. And that is how the woman treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana. Then the householder treasure appeared to King Mahasudassana, with the divine eye which, as the result of Kama, he possessed. He saw where treasure, owned and ownerless, was hidden. He came to the king and said, "Have no fear, your majesty, I will look after your wealth properly." And once the king, to try him, went on board a ship and had it taken to the current in the middle of the Ganges. Then he said to the householder treasurer, "Householder, I want some gold coin." "Well then, sire, let the ship be brought to one bank. I want the gold coins here." Then the householder touched the water with both hands and drew out a vessel full of gold coins, saying, "Is that enough, sire? Will that do, sire?" And the king said, "That is enough, householder, that will do, you have served me enough." And that is how the householder treasurer appeared to King Maha Sudassana. Then the counselor treasurer appeared to King Maha Sudassana. He was wise, experienced, clever and competent to advise the king on how to proceed with what should be proceeded with, and to withdraw from what should be withdrawn from, and to overlook what should be overlooked. He came to the king and said, "Have no fear, your majesty, I shall advise you." And that is how the counselor treasurer appeared to King Maha Sudassana, and how he was equipped with all the 7 treasures. Again, Ananda, King Maha Sudassana was endowed with the 4 properties. What are they? Firstly, the king was handsome, good to look at, pleasing, with a complexion like the finest lotus, surpassing other men. Secondly, he was long-lived, outliving other men. Thirdly, he was free from illness, free from sickness, with a healthy digestion, less subject to cold and heat than that of other men. Fourthly, he was beloved and popular with Brahmins and householders. Just as a father is beloved by his children, so he was with Brahmins and householders. And they were beloved by the king as children are beloved by their father. Once the king set out for the pleasure park with his 4-fold army, and the Brahmins and householders came to him and said, "Pass slowly by, sire, that we may see you as long as possible." And the king said to the charioteer, "Drive the chariots slowly so that I can see these Brahmins and householders as long as possible." Thus King Maha Sudassana was endowed with these 4 properties. Then King Maha Sudassana thought, "Suppose I were to construct lotus ponds between the palm trees, 100 bow lengths apart." And he did so. The lotus ponds were lined with 4 colored tiles, gold, silver, beryl and crystal, each pond being approached by 4 staircases, 1 gold, 1 silver, 1 beryl and 1 crystal. And the gold staircase had gold posts with silver railings and banisters. The silver had silver posts with gold railings and banisters, and so on. And the lotus ponds were provided with 2 kinds of parapet, gold and silver, the gold parapets having gold posts, silver railings and banisters, and the silver parapets having silver posts, gold railings and banisters. Then the king thought, "Suppose I were to provide each pond with suitable flowers for garlands, blue, yellow, red and white lotuses which will last through all seasons without fading." And he did so. Then he thought, "Suppose I were to place bathmen on the banks of these ponds, to bathe those who come there." And he did so. Then he thought, "Suppose I were to establish charitable posts on the banks of these ponds, so that those who want food can get it, those who want drink can get it, those who want clothes can get it, those who want transport can get it, those who want a sleeping place can get it, those who want a wife can get one, and those who want gold coin can get it." And he did so. Then the Brahmins and householders took great wealth and went to the king, saying, "Sire, here is wealth that we have gathered together, especially for your majesty, please accept it." "Thank you, friends, but I have enough wealth from legitimate revenues. Let this be yours, and take away more besides." Being thus refused by the king, they withdrew to one side and considered, "It would not be right for us to take this wealth back home again. Suppose we were to build a dwelling for King Maha Sudassana." So they went to the king and said, "Sire, we would build you a dwelling," and the king accepted by silence. Then Sakka, ruler of the gods, knowing in his mind King Maha Sudassana's thought, said to the attendant Deva Vissakama, "Come, friend Vissakama, and build a dwelling for King Mahasudassana, a palace called Dhamma." "Very good, Lord," Vissakama replied, and, as swiftly as a strong man might stretch his flexed arm or flex it again, he at once vanished from the heaven of the 33 and appeared before King Mahasudassana, and said to him, "Sire, I shall build you a dwelling, a palace called Dhamma." The king assented by silence, and Vissakama built him the palace of Dhamma. The palace of Dhamma, Ananda, was a yojana in length from east to west, and half a yojana wide from north to south. The whole palace was faced up to 3 times a man's height with tiles of 4 colors, gold, silver, beryl and crystal, and it contained 84,000 columns of the same 4 colors. It had 24 staircases of the same 4 colors, and the gold staircases had gold posts with silver railings and banisters. It also had 84,000 chambers of the same colors. In the gold chamber was a silver couch, in the silver chamber a gold couch, in the beryl chamber an ivory couch, and in the crystal chamber a sandalwood couch. On the door of the gold chamber a silver palm tree was figured, with silver stem, gold leaves and fruit. On the door of the silver chamber a golden palm tree was figured, with golden trunk, leaves and fruit. On the door of the beryl chamber a crystal palm tree was figured, with crystal trunk and beryl leaves and fruit. On the door of the crystal chamber a beryl palm tree was figured, with crystal leaves and fruit. Then the king thought, "Suppose I were to make a grove of palm trees all of gold by the door of the great gabled chamber where I sit in the daytime," and he did so. Surrounding the Dhamma palace were 2 parapets, one of gold, one of silver. The gold one had gold posts, silver railings and banisters, and the silver one had silver posts, gold railings and banisters. The Dhamma palace was surrounded by 2 nets of tinkling bells. One net was gold with silver bells, the other silver with gold bells. And when these nets of bells were stirred by the wind their sound was lovely, delightful, sweet and intoxicating, just like that of the 5 kinds of musical instruments played in concert by well-trained and skillful players. And those who were libertines and drunkards in Kusavati had their desires assuaged by the sound of those nets of bells. And when the Dhamma palace was finished, it was hard to look at, dazzling to the eyes, just as in the last month of the rains, in autumn, when there is a clear and cloudless sky, the sun breaking through the mists is hard to look at. So was the Dhamma palace when it was finished. Then the king thought, "Suppose I were to make a lotus lake called Dhamma in front of the Dhamma palace?" So he did so. This lake was a yojana long from east to west, and half a yojana wide from north to south, and lined with 4 kinds of tiles, gold, silver, beryl and crystal. There were 24 staircases to it of 4 different kinds: gold, silver, beryl and crystal. The gold staircases had gold posts with silver railings and banisters. The silver had gold railings and banisters, and so on, as verse 22. The Dhamma lake was surrounded by 7 kinds of palm trees. The sound of the leaves stirred by the wind was lovely, delightful, sweet and intoxicating, just like that of the 5 kinds of musical instruments played in concert by well-trained and skillful players. And, Ananda, those who were libertines and drunkards in Kusavati had their desires assuaged by the sound of the leaves in the wind. When the Dhamma palace and the Dhamma lake were finished, King Mahasudassana, having satisfied every wish of those who at the time were ascetics or Brahmins, or revered as such, ascended into the Dhamma palace. End of first recitation section. Then King Mahasudassana thought, "Of what karma is it the fruit, of what karma is it the result, that I am now so mighty and powerful?" Then he thought, "It is the fruit, the result of 3 kinds of karma, of giving, self-control, and abstinence. Then the king went to the great gabled chamber and, standing at the door, exclaimed, "May the thought of lust cease. May the thought of ill will cease. May the thought of cruelty cease. Thus far and no further the thought of lust, of ill will, of cruelty." Then the king went into the great gabled chamber, sat down cross-legged on the golden couch and, detached from all sense desires, detached from unwholesome mental states, entered and remained in the first jhana, which is with thinking and pondering, born of detachment, filled with delight and joy. And with the subsiding of thinking and pondering, by gaining inner tranquility and oneness of mind, he entered and remained in the second jhana, which is without thinking and pondering, born of concentration, filled with delight and joy. And with the fading away of delight, remaining imperturbable, mindful and clearly aware, he experienced in himself that joy of which the noble ones say, "Happy is he who dwells with equanimity and mindfulness." He entered and remained in the third jhana, and, having given up pleasure and pain, and with the disappearance of former gladness and sadness, he entered and remained in the fourth jhana, which is beyond pleasure and pain, and purified by equanimity and mindfulness. Then the king, emerging from the great gabled chamber, went to the golden gabled chamber and, seated cross-legged on the silver couch, stayed pervading first one quarter, then the second, the third and the fourth quarter with a mind filled with loving kindness. Thus he stayed, spreading the thought of loving kindness above, below and across, everywhere, always with a mind filled with loving kindness, abundant, magnified, unbounded, without hatred or ill will. And he did likewise with compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Of King Maha Sudassana's 84,000 cities, his capital Kusavati was the chief. Of his 84,000 palaces, Dhamma was the chief. Of his 84,000 gabled halls, the great gabled chamber was the chief. His 84,000 couches were of gold, silver, ivory, sandalwood, covered with fleece, wool, spread with kadali deerhide, with head covers, with red cushions at both ends. Of his 84,000 elephants adorned with gold ornaments, with gold banners and spread with gold nets, Uposatha the royal tusker was chief. Of his 84,000 carriages, covered with lion skins, tiger skins, leopard skins, or with orange-colored cloth, adorned with gold ornaments, gold banners and spread with gold nets, the chariot Vijayanta was the chief. Of his 84,000 jewels, the jewel treasure was the chief. Of his 84,000 wives, Queen Subhadra was the chief. Of his 84,000 householders, the householder treasure was the chief. Of his 84,000 Katya retainers, the counselor treasure was the chief. His 84,000 cows had tethers of fine jute and milk pails of silver. His 84,000 bales of clothing were of the finest linen, cotton, silk and wool. His 84,000 rice offerings were there for the taking by those in need, evening and morning. And at that time, King Maha Sudassana's 84,000 elephants waited on him evening and morning. And he thought, "These 84,000 elephants wait on me evening and morning. How if, at the end of each century, 42,000 elephants were to wait on me, turn and turn about?" And he gave instructions accordingly to his counselor treasure, and so it was done. And, Ananda, after many hundred thousand years, Queen Subhadra thought, "It is a long time since I saw King Maha Sudassana. Suppose I were to go and see him?" So she said to her women, "Come now, wash your heads and put on clean clothes. It is long since we saw King Maha Sudassana. We shall go to see him." "Yes, your majesty," they said, and prepared themselves as ordered, then returned to the queen. And Queen Subhadra said to the counselor treasure, "Friend counselor, draw up the fourfold army." It is long since we saw King Maha Sudassana. We shall go and see him. Very good, your majesty, said the counselor treasure, and, having drawn up the fourfold army, he reported to the queen, now is the time to do as your majesty wishes. Then Queen Subhadra went with the fourfold army and her womenfolk to the Dhamma palace and, entering, went to the great gabled chamber and stood leaning against the doorpost. And King Maha Sudassana, thinking, what is this great noise, as of a crowd of people, came out of the door and saw Queen Subhadra leaning against the doorpost. And he said, stay there, Queen, do not enter. Then King Maha Sudassana said to a certain man, here, fellow, go to the great gabled chamber. Bring the gold couch out and lay it down among the gold palm trees. Very good, sire, said the man, and did so. Then King Maha Sudassana adopted the lion posture on his right side with one foot on the other, mindful and clearly aware. Then Queen Subhadra thought, King Maha Sudassana's faculties are purified, his complexion is clear and bright, oh, I hope he is not dead. So she said to him, sire, of your 84,000 cities, Kusavati is the chief. Make a wish, arouse the desire to live there. Thus, reminding him of all his royal possessions. As verse 5, she exhorted him to wish to stay alive. At this, King Maha Sudassana said to the queen, for a long time, Queen, you spoke pleasing, delightful, attractive words to me, but now at this last time your words have been unpleasing, undelightful, unattractive to me. Sire, how then am I to speak to you? This is how you should speak. All things that are pleasing and attractive are liable to change, to vanish, to become otherwise. Do not, sire, die filled with longing. To die filled with longing is painful and blameworthy. Of your 84,000 cities, Kusavati is the chief. Abandon desire, abandon the longing to live with them. Of your 84,000 palaces, Dhamma is the chief. Abandon desire, abandon the longing to live there, and so on throughout, as verse 5. At this, Queen Subhadra cried out and burst into tears. Then, wiping away her tears, she said, sire, all things that are pleasing and attractive are liable to change. Do not, sire, die filled with longing. Soon after this, King Maha Sudassana died, and just as a householder or his son might feel drowsy after a good meal, so he felt the sensation of passing away, and he had a favorable rebirth in the Brahma world. King Maha Sudassana indulged in boyish sports for 84,000 years. For 84,000 years he exercised the vice-royalty, for 84,000 years he ruled as king, and for 84,000 years, as a layman. He lived the holy life in the Dhamma palace. And, having practiced the 4 divine abidings, at the breaking up of the body he was reborn in the Brahma world. Now, Ananda, you might think King Maha Sudassana at that time was somebody else. But you should not regard it so, for I was King Maha Sudassana then. Those 84,000 cities of which Kusavati was the chief were mine, the 84,000 rice offerings were mine. And of those 84,000 cities, I dwelt in just one. Kusavati. Of the 84,000 wives I had, just one looked after me, and she was called Katyani or Valamakani. Of the 84,000 bales of cloth I had just one. Of the 84,000 rice offerings there was just one measure of choice curry that I ate. See, Ananda, how all those conditioned states of the past have vanished and changed. Thus, Ananda, conditioned states are impermanent, they are unstable. They can bring us no comfort, and such being the case, Ananda, we should not rejoice in conditioned states, we should cease to take an interest in them, and be liberated from them. 6 times, Ananda, I recall discarding the body in this place, and at the 7th time I discarded it as a wheel-turning monarch. a righteous king who had conquered the 4 quarters and established a firm rule, and who possessed the 7 treasures. But, Ananda, I do not see any place in this world with its devas and maras and brahmas, or in this generation with its ascetics and brahmins, princes and people, where the Tathagata will for an 8th time discard the body. So the Lord spoke. The well-farer having said this, the teacher said, impermanent or compounded things, prone to rise and fall, having risen, they're destroyed, they're passing truest bliss. As Rode notes, this sutta is an expansion of the conversation recorded at DN 16.5.17f. The same legend also occurs, with some variations analyzed by Rode, in the Maha Sudassana Jataka, number 95. As in DN 5, the Buddha at the end identifies himself, Jataka fashion, with the leading character in the story. The whole thing is deliberately set in an atmosphere of fairy tale splendor. Cf. N.468. 466. The great King of Glory Rode. Rode is probably right in believing that the germ of the story, though not, I think, its Buddhist moral, lies in a sun myth, a theory which in his day was unpopular because of having been overworked. Rode accidentally writes 7 instead of 5. The 5 kinds are given as drums with leather on one side, on both sides, completely covered in leather, cymbals, are bells, and wind, are perhaps feasted their senses, but hardly, I think, danced, as Rode. A ludicrous picture. See Ped under Paricharati. Rode quotes a passage from the Mahayana Sukhavativyuha, a key text of the Pure Land School, as, e.g. Shin in Japan. The land of bliss, Sukhavati, created by Amitabha Buddha for those who have faith in him has features which appear to owe something to this description. But there the effect of the sound of the bells is. And when the men there hear that sound, reflection on Buddha arises in their body sick. Reflection on the law, reflection on the assembly,